Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, participants. We are here for the webinar entitled Unintended Consequences and Trade-offs, Evaluating in the Nexus of Environment, Climate, and Development. This is going to be a 90 minutes webinar. We are now a bit delayed with technical problems, so I will be brief. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of UNICEF and EVALSDGs, who are organizing this webinar in partnership with the Canadian Evaluation Society, the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund, EarthEval, and the Independent Evaluation Office of the Global Environment Facility. Our moderator today, and I will turn over to him, is Evan Green. He's a developer, monitor, and evaluator of international development projects and programs, and national, regional, and international strategies. He is the vice president and senior partner for Bastel, the company he works with. He will be our moderator today, and I'm asking him to please take over. Thank you very much, Evan, and he will introduce the presenters today. Without further ado, over to you, Evan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ada. Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Evan Green, and I am from the company Bastel. It's a Canadian and Belgian monitoring and evaluation firm. I work a lot in monitoring and evaluation, results-based management, disaster risk management, and increasingly the nexus between M&E, RBM, and the SDGs. I'm also here representing the Canadian Evaluation Society as the Canadian representative to the EVALSDGs group. I'm moderating this panel from the Turks and Caicos Islands. I'm not turning on my video so as to not arouse jealousy of the beautiful ocean around me. Here working on an M&E framework and system for the Ministry of Education. I must say I'm quite honored and humbled to be joined by my two presenters on this panel. I'd like to introduce them now. Dr. Jo Puri is the head of the GCF's Independent Evaluation Unit. While she probably does not require any introduction, let me give it a try. She has 23 years of experience in evaluating research in agriculture, environment, health, and infrastructure-related poverty alleviation. She has worked for the World Bank, for UNDP, for UNEP, and for the International Initiative of Impact Evaluation. She's published several books, as you probably know, and written extensively. She's also an adjunct associate professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University in the United States, and also a research fellow at the Center for Evaluation and Development. And I'm also honored to be joined by the other esteemed speaker, Yuha Uito, the director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the GEF. He's worked with the UNDP and the GEF since 1999. And in these capacities, he's conducted and managed a large number of evaluations, primarily focusing on environment and development linkages. He spent the 90s at the UNU as a coordinator of the university's environment and sustainable development research and training programs. He has a PhD in social and economic geography. His books include Evaluating Climate Change Action for Sustainable Development, which he edited with Dr. Jo Puri and Rob Vandenberg, and Evaluating Environment and International Development. He currently serves as the chair of the UNEG Working Group on Integrating Environmental and Social Impacts into Evaluations. Thank you, Ada, for introducing the title of today's webinar. And just to let everybody know of the flow, we are going to have two parts of our presentation this morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending where you find yourself. Dr. Yuha Uito is going to kick things off with a first section on the issue of trade-offs, and Dr. Jo will jump in as well. And after that, we'll have a second part. After I give a very brief summary to the first part, we'll have a second part on tools that will be led by Dr. Jo for the second part of the presentation. And it will be after those two parts of the presentation that we will open up the floor to questions and discussion. So I thank you for your patience as we go through the presentations, and please take note of your comments and questions, and we will have a rich discussion after the two parts of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over first to Juha to start the first part of the presentation on trade-offs. Over to you, Juha.
Thank you very much, Evan, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I shall take over as presenter, as the thing says here. I have to comment on the Turks and Caicos Islands, that there's nothing enviable to be in Washington, D.C. on this gray and cold morning, but and that's reflected in my voice, I'm afraid, also a little bit. Okay, but let me get into the substance. So trade-offs, and that's in the title of this webinar today. As we know, the SDGs are meant to be integrative. They are set to rest on three pillars: social, economic, and environmental. Each of the 17 SDGs is intended to bring together these dimensions and to ensure sustainability on all of the three fronts. In practice, however, I don't think that all of the three dimensions are equal. The social and economic do get much more attention, while the environmental is still treated as an externality and often an afterthought. This seems to be true both in terms of the general discourse as well as priority setting, policy development and programming. And evaluation is no exception to this. It's largely because the profession is so strongly anchored in social sciences and social inquiry. Most evaluators lack the technical capabilities to deal with the natural side of things. And furthermore, this is a consequence of the fact that most interventions themselves are designed to pursue economic and social development. But in reality, there will be no sustained social or economic development if environmental sustainability is not achieved. Therefore, this three-layered cake, to me, is a better analogy than the three pillars, because all the social and economic development rests on the biophysical basis. If the bottom layer collapses, the rest of the edifice will come down too. Consequently, evaluations must also encompass all three dimensions of sustainability. Now, here's another figure, another way of presenting the SDGs. Also, in reality, the SDGs are all integrative, and they contain all three dimensions of sustainability. They also are closely interrelated with each other, and the achievement of each of them depends on each other. This figure that we borrowed somewhere actually just shows how the SDGs, as they have been described officially, how they make the linkages with different SDGs. But this is not a complete picture. So, for example, you can see that there is no linkage from life underwater, that is fisheries and so forth, to food, and no hunger. And that obviously is wrong. That is missing. So there are lots of missing links even in this picture. But you can really see how the SDGs are linked with each other. So, for example, achieving six, 14, and 15. Most of the world's smallholder agriculture is still produced by women who also collect fuel, wood, and water. So that brings in, again, goals 5, 6, and 7. And it is all threatened by climate change, goal 13. So I could go on and on these interlinkages, but you get the point. But in practice, these interlinkages are not obviously always recognized. The SDGs can even form their own silos. Even in the UN system, the SDGs have been divided up between the various agencies, so that FAO deals with goal number 2, while UNIDO deals with goal number 9, and so forth. The GEF, where I work, is not strictly speaking a UN agency, and we are not officially guided by the SDGs in that sense as the UN is, but still our work relates primarily to the goals 13, 14, and 15. But as I will argue later, we have to recognize that you cannot see these goals in separation from the others. As the SDGs are meant to be nationally driven, governments can pick the ones that they prioritize. Consequently, a government could say, they just start with 1, no poverty, 8, decent work and economic growth, and 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, and worry about the rest later. But every intervention takes as its starting point some particular issue and tends to treat the others as externalities. Yet every intervention takes place in a broader system where it interacts with other elements of the system, including the natural environment, as well as human systems, including policies and politics, other interventions, the market, the broader economy, the often conflicting preferences and priorities of different groups, and so forth. It is also safe to say that everything we do has unintended or unanticipated consequences, and they can be either positive or negative. For evaluation, it is essential to identify these unintended or unanticipated consequences and to be clear about where there are trade-offs. Here I've come to the title of our webinar today, Unintended Consequences and Trade-offs. It is not up to the evaluators to make the choices, but it is incumbent upon us to bring these issues out in the open and to the attention of those who make decisions, who make policies, so that they can do their job with full information. In order to do this, we need to consider all interventions as part of the broader context. We cannot evaluate interventions only against their internal logic of whether they did what they set out to do. Instead, we need to be cognizant of how they fit into the wider system, how they interact and with the different parts of the system, and whether they indeed have consequences for other part of the system. Now, we of course always try to go for the best case scenario, but win-win situations are not always possible. However, it is possible that there are synergies between the human and natural systems that can produce outcomes that benefit both economic development and environmental conservation. More often than not, this may not be the case though. Instead, there are trade-offs and these have to be managed. It is worth noting that synergies and trade-offs can coexist in the same system and even within the same intervention. Take, for example, the planting of trees on a slope. This has direct environmental benefits in terms of carbon sequestration, soil and water conservation, and potentially biodiversity, depending on how it is done or what kind of trees you plant. On the economic front, people living downstream are protected from landslides and drought. If these are, for instance, coffee farmers, they can fetch a higher price for their produce grown as shade coffee. But the trade-off might be the opportunity cost of the land that has been forested and thus cannot be used for farming or other income-generating sources. From literature, as well as from our own evaluations, we can identify several types of trade-offs that may commonly occur. These include between environmental and economic objectives, as in that the previous example that I just outlined briefly, between short-term and long-term benefits, between geographical scales, local, regional, national, or national versus global, as would be obviously the case in protecting the common patrimony of the mankind. For example, let's take the Amazon forest, which is very important globally, but has development pressures locally. Or they can also be between and within a specific domain. In the GEF case, we call them focal areas. So they can be trade-offs between, let's say, biodiversity conservation and climate change. Because, for example, a plantation forest can be very good for carbon sequestration and for climate change purposes, but may be poor in terms of biodiversity conservation. Now, let me take a couple of slides just quickly to outline some of the issues that are based on the GEF evaluation of GEF support to multiple benefits. This was a global evaluation that looked into GEF programming through projects that explicitly sought to produce benefits in multiple areas. It included case studies in 4 countries. We first identified what benefits the projects actually produced. Then we looked into potential and actual losses, some of which were unintended or unanticipated, but others may have been the product of conscious choice. We thus were able to analyze how the projects mitigated these trade-offs. And the following were the main features or the main measures taken to mitigate. First, compensation, whereby the losers received financial compensation for their lost income or benefits. Or a compromise, where there were efforts to optimize the total outcome between competing priorities so that each party still received some benefits. Or value addition, where the mitigation of the trade-offs actually resulted in synergies and all groups ended up benefiting. Let me take concrete examples of what I mean here. And these are all from that concrete evaluation that we conducted. In Brazil, the trade-off was between short-term and long-term benefits from ecosystem services, basically. By preserving biodiversity, the project is intended to guarantee sustainability of the ecosystem and which will then provide direct benefits to the farmers in the longer term. However, in the immediate term, they forego the income from the farm. In this case, the Brazilian government provided tax benefits to compensate for the loss of income. So a conscious strategy, recognizing that environmental protection produced negative economic consequences in the immediate short term. In Senegal, the trade-off identified was between biodiversity conservation and community access to resources. Here a compromise was reached by providing the community certain access, while certain previously common practices were prohibited. But this came at the cost of biodiversity protection. So the biodiversity protection couldn't be achieved to the 100%, but you could still find a compromise where the communities were still having access to this nature reserve, and biodiversity was protected because some of the more destructive activities had been prohibited. In China, another case, there were trade-offs between grassland protection and use. The traditional use of indigenous grasses for sheep fodder and bedding for the sheep had resulted in severe grassland degradation, erosion, and flooding. This was a real problem for the communities, for the sheep herding communities. The GEF-funded project found a way to substitute for the traditional use of indigenous grass with providing warm sheds to the sheep and alfalfa for their fodder. This improved the entire system which then ended up protecting the grassland ecosystem and reducing the land degradation and erosion and flooding and so forth. And the herders' houses were also protected. And in the end, at the end of the day, the herders actually saw their incomes rising. Okay, with this more, should I say, conceptual introduction, I will pass it on to Joe.
Thank you, Juha. I can't see the slides, so I don't know whether that's a problem with anyone else. But
it would be, but you should be able to start as a presenter.
I can't. So if you can just
take over as presenter. Do you have that kind of a thingy? Or maybe.
Yeah, if someone can flip them for me, that's fine.
Okay, so I can flip. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can't see any slides as of now. Okay, the next slide, please. This was the China flag. So after this.
Okay, we are coming to your benefits and costs.
Yeah, thank you. So like you have said, this question about benefits and costs and the fact that there are trade-offs is something that we all as evaluators, whether in environment or climate change, have to deal with constantly. One example of a study like this was actually something that Juha and I both worked on, which was looking at the role of local benefits while trying to achieve global environmental benefits for the Global Environment Facility. And this was in 2006. And at that time, the big question was that if the GEF is looking at global environmental benefits, the GEF was still struggling, so to speak, at that point, with this idea that there have to be local benefits or not. And this big evaluation, which lasted definitely longer than a year, then tried to identify as to what could be local benefits, and this is where the question of scale comes in, while trying to achieve global benefits for the Earth as a whole for populations that are located in countries or in smaller targeted areas. And this question then of there being potential trade-offs even within scales and even within on different scales within the same program became fairly salient with that evaluation. Next slide, please. Thank you. One example that I want to give in this context is some work that we looked at when I was working at the World Bank. And here, the question was, one would think, quite primitive, in the sense that we were looking at road construction in Thailand, and the question was, well, is road construction going to lead to deforestation? The question was posed for a large part of northern Thailand, and the received wisdom was exactly what you all probably are thinking, that look, if you construct roads, you're going to it's going to be it's going to lead to deforestation and is consequently going to represent a trade-off. When we looked at this question in a far more detailed way, next slide, please. When we looked at this question in a far more detailed way, what we found is that the type of policy that was being pursued by the government of Thailand was essentially to reduce, was road construction, so that it was primarily reducing agricultural costs for both inputs as well as the cost of transporting agricultural products to the market, which then provided incentives for highland farmers to intensively cultivate the same plot of land rather than extend their extensive agricultural frontiers into forest lands. Put another way, it provided them an incentive to recultivate the same plot of land rather than clear away new plots of land. And this was because they started to concentrate far more on cash crops rather than on subsistence crops, which they could now, because there were reduced transportation costs, which they could now get from the market. So they could get rice from the market, and they could continue to cultivate several cash crops on the same plot of land. This meant that they were more intensively cultivating land rather than extensively cultivating land. This particular policy was then analyzed to show that it was possible to have increased agricultural profitability with road building and reduced deforestation. And so the big idea, or the big takeaway, next clip please, was it was important to measure, and the reason that we discovered that instead of this being a trade-off was that there was a potential win-win happening here, was because we wanted to understand what are the magnitudes that of changes that might be occurring with respect to livelihoods as well as with respect to deforestation. And that made us realize that there was a potential win-win that might be occurring here. So environmental and livelihood benefits were, in this case, simultaneously possible. I think we stop here, Juha, and hand over to Evan.
I wanted to say thank you both to Juha and Joe. And before I move on to section 2, I would like to take an attempt at a 1-minute summary of what we just saw and heard. And again, thank you again to Juha and Joe. Juha kicked us off by showing us some interrelationship between the SDGs and quite a great image about the 3-layered cake and the environmental aspects being at the foundation and bottom of that cake, and highlighting that evaluation needs to encompass all of these interrelationships and all 3 areas. And also that evaluation must take account of both the positive and negative consequences and take the broader context into account as well. We looked at the fact that synergies and trade-offs can occur in the same intervention. And then Juha also brought us through some of the types of trade-offs and how they can be mitigated, looking at compensation and compromise and value addition, and giving some good concrete examples of each of these. And Joe brought us an excellent example of looking at the trade-offs between local and global environmental benefits, and then another that looked at emphasizing the importance of measuring the size of change when looking at benefits and trade-offs. So if I would like to have people take note of any comments or questions you have on part 1. And feel free to share them also in the chat box. I'll take note of them. But what we'll do now is move right into part 2. And now we're going to be looking at tools. And I'm going to ask Joe to kick us off in the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Evan. So I think what both you and I want to show with this second part of this presentation is that, look, today, more than ever, we have the technology and the tools to try and understand what these trade-offs are, what these win-wins are, and therefore how we might mitigate them, how we might create mechanisms for compensation, for value addition, as well as for compromise. Exactly the 3 things that you have mentioned. And so what we want to present in this part of the presentation is to indicate that we have the technology to try and... Can you not hear me? Evan, can you hear me?
Yes, Joe, I hear you just fine.
Okay, good. So we have the technology now that can help us understand both whether trade-offs exist. So the meta-level question, do trade-offs exist, or do we just have win-wins? And then the second level question, which is, if trade-offs exist, what are the magnitudes of trade-offs? What are the wins? What are the benefits on one side? And what are the costs, or what are the losses on the other side? Because like you have said, once we are able to gauge these benefits and costs and present them to the policymaker or to the people who are formulating strategies, then it is up to them to think of strategies that might help to reduce the distance between this benefit and costs. So what I want to talk about today is that technology tools can help us with undertaking these evaluations, because they can help us measure better. They can help us deal with biases in measurement. They can help to provide objective data, which can therefore help us in understanding what the magnitudes of these changes are. But even more significantly, I think the presence of these tools and these technologies help to reduce the costs of undertaking evaluations that are in turn measuring these benefits and costs. Long gone are the days when we shunned measurement, or when we thought about, the cost of evaluations, because in many cases, rigorous evaluations, highly credible evaluations today can be done at very low cost, primarily because we have these technologies and tools. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is that ICTs, communication technologies, can help to reduce bias. Next slide, please. Okay, so one other example of how we use technology and GIS data is an example of how we use technology in Guatemala to understand the impacts on poverty. Now, one would think that it's pretty easy. There was a big World Bank loan that was being put together for $120 million. And the big question was, to what extent is this loan helping to reduce poverty? Loan was being given for road construction, right? So it's being given for road construction. It's a development intervention. And the idea was, okay, tell us how much of poverty reduction is occurring. One would think, well, that's a pretty easy question. Of course, roads are going to lead to poverty reduction because they lead to livelihoods and they lead to markets, etc. But exactly the point of road construction also is that you are going to have these other costs of road construction, namely deforestation, namely a reduction in biodiversity content over the landscapes that you're building roads over. So we wanted to understand the magnitude of poverty reduction as a consequence of road building in Guatemala. Road building, like many other development interventions and environmental interventions, have the problem of what is called endogeneity, or program placement bias. That is, you don't just put a road, somewhere because you throw a dot on the map. You build a road because you build it where people can most benefit from it, or people who are marginalized, etc., can be provided access. But there's a rationale as to why these interventions are placed in the places that they are. This is what is called program placement bias. Put one way, roads can lead to reduced poverty, but the reverse causality is also possible. Reduced poverty in places can also mean that there is a higher likelihood of road construction there, because people where there are low levels of poverty basically are the ones that can lobby for road construction. They are the ones who have access to decision makers. They are the ones who have most to lose from absence of roads. So road construction and poverty, you don't know which causes which. And if you're placing roads in already significantly well-off areas, you could wrongly attribute the income level, in the high income level in those areas, to road construction, right? So if they're already rich places and they are the ones that are getting roads, you could end up saying, hey, these places are so rich and this must be because of road construction. But clearly, this is one classic case of where correlation does not mean causality. Okay? And so this is what we wanted to measure. Next slide, please. The cool thing about this study was that we ended up using a lot of disaggregated data on roads, on geographically, spatially disaggregated data on roads, on administrative jurisdictions, on locations of where World Bank investments were going. We also got headcount data, which had been calculated on poverty, I beg your pardon, which had been calculated at the municipal level for Guatemala, and we combined that with living standard measurements survey data. And we basically were then able to measure the magnitude of effect on various human development indicators. Next slide, please. And what we found is that after we accounted for this potential two-way causality, right, we could still measure the effect of roads on various indicators of human development. So we could say that yes, road construction is leading to a 22% reduction in cost of access to schools, 1/3 reduction in the cost of access to health centers, 16% reduction in access to markets. But what I'm not showing in this slide is that we were also able to see the effect that it was making on the increased likelihood of deforestation. We presented this data to the decision makers, and then it was for them to see. And the effect on deforestation was significantly smaller than all of this. And it was for them to essentially take these magnitudes and make the decision about whether to go forward with road construction or not. Next slide, please. Okay, so ICTs can also help to provide objective and explicit data. And I quickly want to show you a slide on this. Next. Okay, so for example, we want to understand the effect of typhoons on life and health. Now, of course, everyone thinks that typhoons can essentially come and create devastation and lead to human losses immediately in their wake. But what really good wind speed data, as well as measurement of the effect of typhoons a year later, which was all done because it was possible to collect data in real time, as well as high frequency data, as well as follow families over more than a couple of months, was that it showed that damages in the year after typhoons, especially on mortality, was greater by 15:1. And this was mainly the big effect that was occurring in terms of childhood mortality. This is because people started to reduce the importance of nutrition, especially for girl babies, when typhoons occurred, and this then had an effect on their mortality rates a year later. Yeah, and all of this was possible, and all of this is possible primarily because we are able to collect high frequency data and also track families as we go along. Next, please. So keeping that same strain of thought, again, GIS data and can help to provide objective data, which can help with better evaluations. In a completely different study, we looked at the impact of protected areas on actually reducing deforestation. And we were able to use GIS data to say that if you allow for what is called, again, placement bias, that is, most protected areas tend to be located in areas, at least when you're looking at a cross-section, tend to be located in areas where agricultural profitability is quite low. So people would not go to these places anyway. Then you end up establishing that at least over the short run, the benefits of establishing protected areas on deforestation are actually quite small. And we could show this because we were able to use GIS data. Next, please. The last point I want to quickly make is that ICTs help to reduce costs of evaluations. Again, this is not surprising for many of you. Next. So ICTs ICTs, mobile phone data, wearable data. Next, please. And keep going. We now have data on where projects are located. We can overlay these with vegetation data, with physiographic data, with health data, with development data, environmental data. So the top left corner of your screen is showing the location of World Bank projects in DRC. In different programs and evaluations, we're also looking at the impact of what could be climate change interventions, but also on disease patterns. And so immunization patterns and immunization rates are infamously hard to capture because there's a social desirability bias there. but you can track immunization rates with wearable data now. So, you know, that little child is wearing something around his neck, and you can figure out whether he's been immunized or not. You can also collect rapid SMS reports for patient registers, things that would take earlier 3, 4, 5 years to collect data on, to clean, etc. Now, with the help of SMS and mobile data, you just have algorithms. You have them ready in less than 24 hours. In a very different group of studies that I was involved in when I was at 3IE, we also looked at the effect of water and sanitation, I beg your pardon, of government policy on latrine use and open defecation, which has implications for both health but also for the environment, right? And again, typically, open defecation data is very hard to capture because of social desirability bias again. So things such as passive latrine use monitors can be used to understand and to measure something like this. Yeah, next please. So I'm going to quickly hand this over to Juha, but I just want to say that, look, ICTs can help to improve data quality and measure exactly these trade-offs, the magnitudes, the directions. But they also then help us to get reliable data and understand whether it's replicable or not. So if we collect again, will it be the same data from the same person if at the same time? Do we know whether it's reliable, replicable? Is it valid or not? Are we measuring what we are saying we are measuring? It can help us to increase data integrity, but of course we also know we live in the age of Trump, whether, you know, the data can also be manipulated a lot more, but at least we know we can trace those things and do that quickly. They can also help us to understand whether data are accurate or not, and what they are measuring, and whether they are timely, and whether how to keep data secure. So now technologies can help us store our data much better. Sorry, I misspoke. I do have one more slide before I hand it over to Juha, and this is essentially about costs of evaluations, which is something I referred to earlier. Now, with these technologies, I do want to underscore this. In one of the Thailand evaluations that I did, the cost of our data collection using GIS data was zero, because a lot of the GIS data on deforestation, on land use, on road building, etc., was all open source. Now, 1 square meter resolution satellite data can be procured at either very little cost or no cost, depending on you know, how far back you want to go. When I was working at Columbia University, the time for processing data using technology for the Millennium Villages reduced from 3 years to 3 months, because we started to use handhelds. And impact evaluations with GIS can cost up to 75% less than what they would if you were collecting survey data that was traditionally collected. And in other cases, given that we are now living in a world where we have high frequency data, I think we have to start changing our thinking as well about, you know, sample sizes and our analysis methods. But one other example of other, you know, work that we did, one click please, was that because we had data available, we also understood that the total number of sample points that we actually required for our evaluations was far lesser than the 6,000 women that were originally collected for the evaluation, and all we needed to understand the effect was approximately 700 women that we needed data on, and that's the matrix or the table that you're seeing on your bottom right corner. So click please, and you'll be able to see Evan or Thomas, whoever is doing this. If you could click once more. Okay, yeah, exactly. So essentially this all this showed was that we had sufficient data, even with 700 observations. It was sufficient for us to measure the effect that we wanted to measure. I'm going to stop here and ask Juha to come in on geospatial analysis. Juha, over to you.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's more of the same, and you've talked about it already, Joe, a little bit. But at the GEFIEO, we have really started using geospatial techniques and analysis quite widely in our evaluations. We started this several years back, actually, and we did it initially in some large global evaluations, such as looking at the impact of protected areas and protected area systems on biodiversity conservation, as well as then land degradation and so on. But the beauty of these techniques is also the fact that they are highly versatile, and they can be used at different scales, at different levels, for different purposes, and so forth. So at its most basic that we've done using geospatial and techniques has been to simply mapping the location of projects. Where are they taking place? And this has helped us to determine the relevance of the interventions in terms of priority areas. For example, in this when we mapped the protected areas that the GEF was supporting, we could lay them geographically against biodiversity hotspots and global priority areas and national priority areas, and then determine whether the GEF was actually working in the right areas. So that's quite a simple analysis. I should say, however, that the initial cost was there because many of the projects did not have location data, but once that was done, this was a relatively easy task to do, and now these early evaluations actually affected GEF policy, and now new projects are supposed to contain that location data, so there's no need to do that again. We can also use especially remote sensing data to create baselines where they don't exist, which, as we know as evaluators, that they often do not exist. But the fact with this, like Joe was saying, much of this data, remote sensing imagery and so forth, is either free or very low cost. And you have long time series, so you can actually go to your project sites before the project started and recreate a time series from till today. And you can look into things such as land use, forest cover, vegetation productivity, but also of course social and economic aspects, whether it's settlements or infrastructure or road networks or whatever. And such geospatial data can also be used to identify control sites that are similar in characteristics to the project sites when you control for distance from urban centers, distance from roads, elevation, precipitation data, and so forth. And therefore you can then, it allows you to analyze the factors that influence outcomes in a comparative way. And we've also done analysis regarding value for money, for example, of carbon sequestration by analyzing the land use, land cover change against, and then comparing that against estimated value of ecosystem services. So how much is you can estimate based on scientific knowledge and economic knowledge. You can say that, okay, this much of primary forest sequesters this much of carbon, and you know the carbon price, so you can calculate what the benefits of avoided deforestation in terms of carbon, for example, are. Okay, so just a final example. We environmental characters like myself, we tend to blame the other side. Like I started my presentation with, saying that the evaluators do not understand necessarily the natural science side of things, but the opposite is true as well. And in the GEF, for the first 20 years of the GEF's existence, we focused exclusively on the global environmental benefits in terms of biodiversity conservation, climate change, and land degradation, and water, and so forth. And we treated people as externalities, and treated people basically as keeping them out of the protected areas and so forth. The 2006 evaluation that Joe referred to, in which we both were involved, was a landmark in that sense that we actually started thinking about more closely about linkages between human and natural systems. And now we have come to the situation where we do have to pay attention and measure what we call the socioeconomic co-benefits, because these are necessary for achieving our environmental goals. So here's a case study of Uganda that we did quite recently using multiple data sources. This was a program, an evaluation evaluating GEF support to sustainable forest management. And we used geospatial data initially to identify the GEF project sites. Where did the project take place? And what happened to the forest cover in and around these project sites? We complemented it with nightlight data analysis, which is nightlight data is a pretty good proxy for economic development. You can see where people are and whether they have energy in the night. And then we added to this the World Bank household survey data. This is the same survey that Joe was referring to in the case of Guatemala, the Living Standards Measurement Survey, the LSMS, and which had also geospatial and geographic coordinates. So you could overlay all these layers, and you could triangulate. And again, all of this data analysis was virtually free, and we ended up collecting very precious little additional data at this level. Of course, you have to, in this kind of a case, you can provide correlation, but not necessarily understand the causality. And for that, you will still have to use some more traditional evaluation methods. But the point is that this facilitates the actual quantification of benefits and losses in a much more cost-effective manner. Joe, do you want to say these conclusions then, please?
Sure, thank you, Juha. So basically, we're concluding with this section by saying that, look, we have the technologies and the tools today that can help us quantify benefits and costs, because while doing that, they help us to deal with biases in measurement. They help us to get objective data, and they also help us to reduce the cost of evaluations far more than what was possible traditionally. But of course, we also remain somewhat more circumspect, because as we go into this space, which is very exciting and state-of-the-art, we also need to keep thinking about standardization, consent, abuse of data, privacy, and the methods that we are using. Because, like I said, a lot of the methods that we are using for analysis still remain quite traditional, and they remain steeped in earlier antiquated thinking, that is that data is high-frequency data or big data is still expensive. That is no longer true. And if that is no longer true, we need to change our analytical methods as well. With that, thank you so much from both you and me for listening in, and over back to Evan.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you, Juha, as well, for bringing us through the second part of the presentation, which was about tools. And if you'll allow me to give a quick 1-minute summary of part 2, we talked about how ICT can help reduce the bias in evaluation, and Joe brought an example of the interlinkages between road construction and poverty. We also talked about how ICT can bring more objective and explicit data, and examples were brought from Philippines and Thailand. We then looked at how ICT can also help to reduce the cost of evaluations, and some excellent examples were brought, like wearable data and SMS reports, and another example from Thailand as well. And of course, how ICT can help improve data quality. And we looked at some of the key issues related to data quality: validity, reliability, integrity, accuracy, timeliness, etc. And then we looked at some of the issues that can be or are being addressed through geospatial analysis. An example was brought of baselines and some interesting data that is being brought to fill those gaps. During that second discussion, there were a number of questions and comments that were brought in the chat box. One of which even questioned, whether or not these kind of benefits through remote sensing data, does that assume that this data is free, for example, and would that affect whether or not these are actual benefits to be taken into account? So let me take a moment to say, well, we're exactly where we should be. We have approximately 1/2 hour left scheduled in this webinar, and this was the time we wanted to have some open questions and discussion about either part 1 or part 2. And thanks again to both Joe and Juha for bringing excellent presentations and hopefully stimulating some interesting discussions. I have taken note of a couple of questions that emerged, but before I share those, maybe I can ask if anyone in the webinar would like to actually share and raise a discussion using your audio, and you can unmute yourself and share a question right now. Hearing none for the moment.
Hi,
yes,
sorry.
Please.
Thank you. Hi, this is Michael Kraft. I'm here at the UNICEF office listening in, and I just had a quick follow-up to one of the points mentioned by Joe regarding the Guatemala study. And I was really curious as to, sorry, can you mute the mic or something? Whether or not, based on the point you're making about kind of leaving policymakers with information to then make the decision, I was curious about, kind of this issue around communicating trade-offs following, the findings of the evaluation, and obviously using the most rigorous methods and whatnot, how you kind of manage around this communication to policymakers who are then ultimately have the decision-making power to, to then take forward the information presented in the evaluation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. I'm gonna turn it over to either Juha or Joe to please chime in on that question. And for anyone else who has questions, I do understand we can't unmute all the microphones, so please share your questions in the chat box, and I will share them with the speakers for them to be able to respond. Thank you so much. Over to you, Joe or Juha, to respond to that one.
Thanks.
I think Michael was directing it to Joe, so why don't you?
Okay, thanks, Juha. I might ask you to come in, of course, if you feel like. So I think my response, actually, Michael, is quite basic. I think from where I'm sitting now, but also previously, I think policymakers and people who have to develop strategies are far more aware of trade-offs than we give them credit for. I think the important thing then just becomes how do we help them weigh what those trade-offs are? And frankly, when we are measuring these benefits or when we are measuring these costs, that's what we're helping them do. we're helping them weight them, and then we are helping them think about exactly the compensation, value addition, and compromise strategies that they might attach alongside what would be par for the course for them. That is, yes, they're going to go ahead and build a road nonetheless, but with the additional information on the costs of road building, now they do want to think about, how are they going to help stakeholders who've been adversely affected mitigate some of those costs. So mine is a very, how should I say, very basic response, mainly because I think that as evaluators, we tend to give less credit to decision makers and strategy proponents in terms of their own nuanced understanding of trade-offs. I think where we need to develop our craft a lot more is not so much in presentation, but in being very much more upfront about these trade-offs and examining them in a far more head-on way compared to what we've done traditionally. I'm going to stop here and see if Juha wants to come in.
Well, actually, I agree with you fully, and one of the things is really sometimes evaluations. I think we bring in our own biases also, and provide some recommendations based on what we think. But I think that it would be much more valuable often to really to bring to, like Joe says, upfront, information on what are the trade-offs, that there are trade-offs, and you as decision makers, not as evaluators, you will have to make the choices. You will have to value what is important here, and also apart from the internal trade-offs in projects, for example. So it's often useful then to also to point out what are the other countervening factors that might work against you, and these include things like subsidies, because I'm concerned about environmentally destructive subsidies, whether it's in agriculture or in energy or whatever. But for example, the evaluations can also point to these issues, that that your enabling environment where you are operating is hampered by these things, and if you truly wish to make a change, you may have to look outside of the projects and actually try to deal with the regulatory and legal frameworks and policy frameworks and so forth. And hence, I think it's very important that evaluations take a broader look than just a very narrow internal project-oriented look.
Okay, thank you both Juha and Joe for that. We have a number of questions coming in here, so I'm going to share them with you. I believe this first one is more directed at Joe, but as always, Juha, you can also come in. Matthias was asking on the road, the example of the road and the poverty effects, the interlinkages. Was there a counterfactual, and if so, what was the counterfactual in that example?
In the Guatemala example?
Yes, the one in the interlinkages between the road construction and poverty.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Matthias. So what we did do there was what's called propensity score matching. We had data we used the LSMS data and we superimposed it basically on the poverty map that I showed to you as well. And one cool thing that I didn't have time to show to you is actually if you look at where the road density is and where poverty is, you'll find that poverty is lower in areas where there's high road density. So again, it's that, which comes first question. But to answer your question, we use the technique that is called propensity score matching, which basically means that we were trying to mirror a randomization technique, but of course we can't do that with road construction and with a whole lot of development programs. So we then constructed comparison sites. I hate calling them control sites because that's what is used in medical science, but these are in development spaces. You can't really control them. And so we ended up creating comparison sites where the likelihood that these sites are the same as the ones that got the road construction is very high. But the big difference between those two is the fact that one got the road construction and the other one did not. And we basically then compared counterfactual areas using propensity score matching. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question, I believe, is to both Joe and Juha, and it comes from Lori Bell. And the question is, does this cost reduction, I mentioned it in my summary, does the cost reduction with regards to remote sensing data, does this assume that that data is free?
I don't think we're assuming that it's free. What I think what I'm trying to say anyway is that in many cases, this data is, this high densities, geographically, spatially disaggregated data is either available free, and in my cases, all of the examples that I gave they were free data. So we were able to get them free of cost. But of course, satellite data today is also commercially available, and you have to pay for, for very recent data, and if you want the same panel over and over again, and if you want it to be even higher resolution than say 30 square meters, then of course you have to pay for it. But the cost of that data is diminishing, precipitously. And I think the overall point is that we can now do much cooler analysis, much more rigorous and credible analysis for a far smaller cost than we would have anticipated even 20 years ago. Juha?
Yeah, and just to complement that, one of the things is, of course, that you have to have the capacity to understand and analyze this data, which may require some computing capacities. We have in our office, for example, we have the capacity to understand it and to design evaluations around it, and so we have people who have been trained in remote sensing and GIS analysis and so forth, and who can do this work. However, we don't have that the computing capacity here. But here's the beauty of it. You can also get very cheap or free labor in using students, for example. So we work quite a lot with universities, mostly in the DC area, but it's not limited by geography there, because you have university departments where you have students who are working on their graduate theses or whatever, or they have capstone projects where they benefit from having a real world problem to work on, for example. So that's been quite a boon for us, is that we have a relationship with a couple of universities where the professors say that, hey, we have this guy here who is designing his final project. Do you have a thing for her to analyze? And we say, sure, why don't you help us with this case study?
Okay, thank you, Joe and Juha. The next question is for another question from Matthias, which was whether the compensation in the Brazil example, so this is directed more for you, Juha, whether it had some negative impacts as well. And he mentioned that some studies have shown that sometimes the PS normally benefit the already well-off and increase some land grabbing and extension of the agricultural frontier as the poor are pushed to reclaim more land for settlement. So he wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Quite frankly, I would have to go back more deeply into the case study, but as far as I remember, we didn't identify these issues at this stage. The whole thing was really to enhance the longer-term sustainability of the land system at this place, and just to bridge over the farmers with the tax credits during that period. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Juha. And just one issue that was brought up by Elsa Garcia on the issue of using the remote sensor data, that we should bear in mind the issue of sensor maintenance and the local capacity for maintenance of sensors. That's something that should be addressed as well as we become not necessarily dependent, but using this kind of data more and more often. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, either Joe or Juha.
Not really. Point well taken.
Point well taken. Yeah, I agree with that comment as well. Next comment comes from Luisa Belli, and was asking about whether or not there is some further literature that can be referred to in the use of GIS and ICT in evaluation, and in particular looking at that issue of Guatemala. So Joe, I don't know if you can chime in on this before you need to run away. And just a note to everyone, Joe does have to go catch a plane. She has kindly been facilitating this from the airport, and will need to run soon to catch her flight to Madrid. But Joe, before you go, I don't know if you wanted to just comment on this one.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and actually my senior moment, I did want to discuss this with Juha before we started the webinar, that we could have put together a list of resources with web links that you could all possibly use if you wanted literature. I have a lot of papers that I can refer to, but maybe Lisa, what I can do, and perhaps I can hand it over, and you and I can put something like this together and hand it over to Ada to circulate it. Yeah, I think that would be good, and apologies that I didn't think of it earlier.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Joe. And that would be certainly helpful. I mean, along similar lines, we also had a comment or question from Nicole, who was asking with regards to trade-offs, if there is any sort of guidelines or documents on designing effective evaluations that actually assess the trade-offs between the economic, the social, the environmental, and how to roll them into the net benefit, that she would appreciate some direction in that regard as well.
Yeah, again, I think we can refer to some studies. I know Vinod Thomas, who is known to all of us, I think Kevin and Ada, and definitely Juha and I, just did an entire book on trying to understand what these trade-offs could be and what sorts of techniques we could use to understand these costs and benefits. I'll send that reference along, and then we can try and put something else together, I'm sure. Thank you.
Let me just supplement with the fact that, there's in both cases when it comes to using, geospatial methods, and it comes to trade-offs and all of that stuff. So what we try to do, for example, is, there's evaluation literature, and the evaluation literature is emerging. It's not very large yet, I think, in either fields, but there is other research literature, and sometimes we start evaluations without considering what the research community has done in these areas, and it's quite useful to start your evaluation by looking at the doing a scan of recent literature on what do we know about these things. So especially in an area like where you deal with natural systems, or coupled human and natural systems, there's a huge literature about that. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can. It will help us to better define the scope of our evaluations, the set of better questions, and set better hypotheses based on the actual research literature.
Okay, thank you for that, Juha. We have approximately 10 minutes left. I'm going to try and get to everybody's questions as efficiently as possible. The next question comes from Jindra Shekan. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. It's a question for you, Ha, which works well given that Joe needs to run. Would you or have you ever used GIS to evaluate post-project sustainability?
Yes, indeed. Very, very. I'm happy that this question came actually, because it was one thing that I was considering whether we should somehow get into this presentation. We have done that, and actually this is a good example of where we have used where we have worked with University of Maryland students and professors. In this case, we took a number of case studies. Basically, if I remember correctly, they were in places like Vietnam and the Philippines and Cambodia. Don't quote me on exactly on every country, where they had basically again either protected area or sustainable forest management type of projects, which were geographical scopes, and we took then remote sensing data from the beginning of that project and before the project until the end of the project, and years after the project, and looked at what happened to forest cover, vegetation productivity, encroachment of agriculture, and so forth into these protected areas, and then analyzed also what were the main reasons, what were the drivers of change. Were they, for example, agriculture expansion? Was it infrastructure? Was it extraction for mining or whatever? And you could do this analysis, and it's quite interesting. And just to as a bottom line is that the picture that emerged was quite varied, and it depends very much on the location of the projects.
Thank you, Juha. I'm going to jump to Johnny Morell's question, wanting to get back to the connection amongst the SDGs where we started the presentation, and shared that it's easy to envision all kinds of connections between the SDGs, but it's not usually true that everything is connected to everything else, and that influences between the nodes can be qualitatively different, and network structures matter, and so on. Is there any analysis that you know of the actual network characteristics?
Well, the figure that I showed was an analysis of how the SDGs themselves were designed and how they recognize the linkages between each other. And I agree with Johnny that, of course, not everything affects everything equally, and there are things that are further from each other than others, and others are, again, very closely linked. I think that would be a very good thing to do. I am aware that there have been some attempts at linking, for example, particular SDGs or looking at particular SDGs and seeing their linkages, but I'm not sure that there has been a fully comprehensive mapping that has been done. But like, for example, I mentioned here earlier this thing that, the way that the SDGs were designed and recognizing their linkages, that wasn't comprehensive, and that struck me so strongly was this, that the fisheries or the life underwater and so forth it was linked to economic development, but it wasn't linked to poverty and hunger directly, and 1 billion people rely on coastal fisheries, for example, for their protein.
Okay, thank you, Juha. I'll jump quickly now also to Luisa's question, mentioning that surely there are trade-offs between the SDGs, and that this dovetails with what you were just talking about, Juha. Is there any study or publication that can be reviewed that addresses the weighing of the trade-offs between the SDGs, or would your answer be similar to the previous?
Yeah, I think that it's work in progress.
I think that's a fair response. There was some interesting chatting as well in the chat box. I would encourage people to take a look around that, just so we don't run out of time. I want to try and get to everybody's question. The next question comes from Andy Rowe. To what extent are the data and analytical capacities scalable downwards from the larger evaluations that you pointed out, or that Joe pointed to, right down to the project level evaluations?
Yeah, obviously they are scalable downwards. You know, let's say, so in our protected areas evaluation, for example, so we started on a global picture, but then we focused on different you know, protected areas around the world, and we also then did a case study on Mexico, where GEF has had a long-term engagement. And then we looked into specific areas in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, where we got to the actual, you know, site, local site, where we were able to discover that in the protected areas there were actually illegal cattle ranching going on. We were able to use remote sensing data that actually was at a resolution that allowed us to, like we said, count the cows. So you can do that. And so the technology and the approaches are totally scalable. It depends, of course, then the higher the resolution is, the more demanding it may get, then you may have to pay some money for the analysis and so forth, and to the data, but still, you know, you can do that. And the same as was the question from Jindra about the post-completion verification or post-completion analysis, where we looked in Vietnam and in other places at specific project sites. How far does it go?
Thank you, Juha. I think we have time left for one more question. I see one at the bottom of the chat here from Andy Rowe, and he notes an important point, looking at the research literature and talking with researchers early on. He mentions that Eleanor Shalimsky has written well about this, but what about traditional and local knowledge? It is often much more focused on the places of intervention and often has appropriate temporal and spatial scales, and is in fact often a time series. Have you ever used bigger data to identify potential nodes where this knowledge might be available and followed up on in your case studies?
I think that's extremely important. And we have done it much less than we should have done, but it's also the nature of the type of evaluations we do, because we tend to operate at the higher programmatic level rather than at the project sites, except for you know, case studies. There was an example recently, though, for example, where a colleague of mine, this was in West Africa, in a particular site where we did some analysis, geospatial analysis using remote sensing data and time series data here in Washington, and then my colleague went to the villages with the maps that we had generated and talked with the villagers and talked with the local people and compared you know, their knowledge with what we had gleaned from the sky, so to speak, and it worked apparently extremely well, and the villagers in this local area were totally comfortable with understanding and using these maps and explaining what had happened and so forth, what were some of the reasons. So there are some examples, but that's not the type of evaluations that we usually do. But I fully agree with Andy that this is extremely important.
Thank you so much, Juha. From my part, I will at least do my duty to thank you for an excellent set of presentations and an excellent set of responses to some very important and some challenging questions. And it's been both a pleasure and an honor to be part of this panel. We've reached 10:30, so I think it's my job now to turn things back over to Ada, perhaps to close things off. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, done. Okay, thank you very, very much, Juha, Joe, that is not with us now, but and Evan for such an outstanding presentation, moderation, discussion, etc. This has been really a high quality webinar, and we are grateful to you in your capacity of facilitators, also representative of our partners for this webinar, the Independent Evaluation Office of GEF, Canadian Evaluation Society, and Bastel, and the Independent Evaluation Office of the Green Climate Fund, and Earth Eval. On behalf of the partners and UNICEF and EVALSDGs, we thank you very much to all participants for their for being present today, for those who asked questions, comments, and have been with us in a very active mode. As many participants have asked questions that I want to reiterate, we will be distributing the presentation and the recording in the coming days. Please bear with us. We cannot do it today or tomorrow, but we will do it pretty soon. And also, as Joe has mentioned, she and Juha will put together a list of resources that I will be happy to also distribute with you. Thank you very, very much. Once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Thank you. A big clap to our presenters.
Best wishes, everyone. Thank you.
And moderator.
Day or night.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Stop recording.